right, I think we are live. Bismillahi wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Welcome everybody to today's, this is the third episode of the Faith Edge podcast. And today we're talking about a topic that many people are suffering from in silence. And thinking back to my own journey of personal development, it is something that I've had to overcome as well. And I wish I had the guidance of the likes of the panelists that we have here today. So we are going to be talking about addiction and breaking free from addiction. We're going to dive into what that means, what the most prominent types of addictions are, and hear from individuals who've been on a journey themselves and are now on a mission to help others break free as well. So today we are very, very lucky to be joined by Luke Worsfold, who is an addiction therapist and CEO of Lisa Inside Addiction. He specializes in drug and alcohol dependency. He's done over 3,500 hours of counseling and uses CBT and DBT and person-centered methods. His work is actually driven by his own journey of sobriety. And Luke holds a counseling degree from the University of Essex and is a registered member of the BACP and the FDAP. Luke, welcome to today's podcast.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thanks for the amazing introduction. Cheers.
You're most welcome. We also have Joshua, who's actually joining us all the way from Boston in the USA, who is a pornography addiction expert and certified betrayal trauma coach and also an author. And he's dedicated to helping individuals and couples overcome pornography addiction and betrayal trauma. Now, drawing from his recovery from this kind of addiction and alcoholism, he has supported over 500 clients since 2020. He's authored 4 books, including The Addiction Nobody Talks About and He's a Porn Addict, Now What? And has delivered over 200 interviews and a TEDx talk on the subject. We also have with us, very fortunate to have Dr. Nasir with us as well, who's actually a medical doctor and specializing in liver medicine. He has extensive specialist experience managing patients with alcohol-related liver diseases, from addiction recovery all the way to transplantation. He is also a self-development coach with Wise Life Academy and has a strong interest in self-development and the pursuit of excellence. Now, we've got the intros out the way. I want to jump into the meat, the meat of today's conversation. So I'm going to start with a question for all of the panelists, if that's okay. And that question is, how would you each define how would you define addiction? What's your definition for it? And I'd love to start with Luke.
Yeah, so I would say it's a repetitive behavior or substance that you take despite the negative consequences to your life. I'll just keep it short and sweet like that.
Fantastic. And Joshua?
Yeah, I'm very much there with Luke. I believe that it is an inability to stop a negative behavior or using a negative substance despite fully understanding that it's going to end badly.
Interesting. Dr. Nasir?
I've got to say, those two definitions just given by Luke and Joshua there are perfect. They summarize the whole concept brilliantly. And the key things just to notice, because there'll be people watching here who sometimes maybe have bad habits and aren't quite sure if they're addicted. People always seem to feel until things get too late that they're not addicted and they can stop when they want to. But what Luke started with, habit or repetitive behavior, It's people repeating a behavior until it gets to a point where it's hard or difficult to stop, which is what Joshua just touched on. Despite knowing, and this is one of the addiction, is it causes harm. So it's a compulsive, habitual behavior that results in harm. And I think that's a really nice way to summarize it. That's brilliantly.
I love that. I love that. And in your experience, what would you say is a big misconception about addiction? And we'll start from Dr. Nasir and work our way back.
I think the problem I find that people find with addiction is how to get better and how to stop. And the two things that seem to get in people's way is feelings of shame, feelings of hopelessness, and thinking that when they try and they fail, that's it. They can't help themselves. And what people don't tend to get taught or don't realize is the change that's actually happening when people are addicted. I won't go on too long, but people need to understand that there's a physiological change that happens in the brain with addiction. So stopping isn't something where you just wake up and say, I feel like stopping, and then you can end it. And recognizing that your brain has changed, meaning to recover from addiction, you have to rewire and get the brain back to normal. In most people, helps them understand, okay, this is going to be a journey and not a quick fix or a quick step.
Joshua, what would you say is a common misconception?
Well, I love what the doctor just said. One of the things that I explained to people was that, I was a pornography addict for 24 years. I was an alcoholic for 22 years. It takes a long time to get to rock bottom. It's not going to be one day or one session to climb out of it. When I describe it to people, or I describe recovery to people, the first thing I say is it's not simply just stopping the behavior. That is not recovery. To me, recovery is about answering the question, how did I become the person I did today? And how did the substance or behavior change and affect who I am on that journey? I think that needs to be examined as much as anything else that has to do with the nuts and bolts of the addiction itself. And when I talk to people about this, it took you a long time to get here. It's going to take a while to pull out of it. It's not a light switch. It's more of a dimmer switch that goes very slowly. And it took me 24 years to get into a pornography addiction. It took me about 2 years to pull out of it. That's only 1/12 of the time, but when you're in it, 2 years can seem like a long time. So I also try to tell people this is not like going on a diet. This is a full life change. This is not about an obese person not eating for 30 days. This is about an obese person figuring out, how did I get obese in the first place? That's more where you're going to find recovery than just in stopping the behavior itself.
That's a very profound insight, actually. And Luke, what's your, what's the main misconception that you find in your work keeps popping up?
Yeah, so I agree with the others in the sense that it's important to rewire your brain and to look into why this is happening in the first place in order to change, and that it is, a journey that does take time. It's not an overnight process. But for me, in the work that I do, one of the misconceptions I would say is the clients sometimes feel that they have to get to some really bad rock bottom place before they can change. A lot of clients, say for drinking as an example, they feel like they need to be drinking all day from noon to night, a litre of vodka a day before they need to get help. Now, a lot of the clients I work with are functioning professionals who aren't at that level. Maybe they're struggling with a glass of wine a night or a bottle of wine a night, but they're not drinking all day. Or maybe it's just at the weekend they're having a binge drinking session and they're drinking a lot in one sitting. And it's important for people to realise that you don't have to be the stereotypical kind of addict in order to seek help. If you feel like it's showing up negatively in your life and having it and becoming a problem, then it is time to get help and to kind of break free from some of that denial and to reach out to someone to get some support.
I'm just going to just jump in, Tanim. I thought that was fantastic what Luke just said, because that is people in my profession. I most commonly see people when they've got advanced liver disease. The alcohol has harmed them so much that the impact on their health is forced them, if you like, that they have to come up with a solution. Yeah. But when we look at the journey of addiction, it's why do people, let's say, do anything, any addictive substance, whether it's pornography, alcohol, drugs, overeating? They do it because it induces pleasure. It makes you happy. So that's why people don't pick up an addictive substance or behavior because they know in the long term it's going to cause them damage. It starts by causing pleasure. So people do it because they get this short-term relief of whether it's dopamine, serotonin, glutamate. It releases pleasure neurochemicals. And the harm comes when that behavior is repeated consistently. Because what happens is the body, which loves balance, so there's a term called homeostasis. So when you're getting these repetitive pleasure hormones, the body will try to compensate. So your inhibitory hormones will start to raise. And what happens is people then go from a repetitive behavior that was giving them pleasure to developing tolerance. And at that stage, the amount that they were using doesn't give them the same pleasure because the body's now rebalanced. Spot on. And when you develop tolerance, in order to get that pleasure, you now need more. Or maybe in the case of pornography, you now need more extreme porns or something different, instead of your typical vanilla, if you like, types. And by seeking that additional pleasure, you keep pushing up the pleasure hormones, if you like, and the body keeps trying to compensate to a point where now, when you don't have the substance or the behavior, you get withdrawal symptoms. By not having it, the counter chemicals are so high that you start feeling anxious, unwell, withdrawal symptoms. In the case of alcohol, which all three of us have got experience in, is people will have withdrawal seizures. Trying to stop can be detrimental to your health. And if you understand that, that also helps you understand that it's got to be done, or you've got to be on a journey and recover slowly. And it'd be lovely to hear from Luke and Josh to see where they recognize their addiction, if you like, and at what point or what strategies they use now to help others to try to get them to realize that they need help earlier.
Yeah, so I think for me, what is important, what resonated from what you said is, some people wait, and like the people you see, until they have liver damage or cirrhosis of the liver, etc. And that's what happened to my mum. She eventually got to the point where her liver failed and she passed away when I was 10 years old from drinking. And she kind of didn't get help and waited until that point. And that's really, really sad. And the thing is a lot of us do wait too long. So for me, when I was going through my own journey of drinking and using drugs, I realized, why do I want to wait that long? Why do I want to keep going down this path over and over again? It's only going to end in one way, in death, like my mum showed me, right? And I kind of learned from her, that her life wasn't the example, her death was the lesson of what not to do and to not wait that long. So that's why I decided to kind of make that change in my life sooner rather than later, because I didn't want to keep going down that path and having those get to the point where the consequences are even worse and worse and worse. So I think it's important for people to change when they start to recognize it being a problem, for sure.
Brilliant.
For myself, I was in denial just as much as most of my clients today are in denial. And pornography addiction is still such a new concept to so many people. And the idea of just simply watching pornography is such a taboo for so many people that they don't want to admit that they consume it, much less that they might be an addict. And what I try to say, we don't have to use the word addict if you don't want to. Addict is a label. Do you want to call it a bad hobby? Do you want, I can call you whatever you want to be called. If you want to be called a pretty princess, okay, let's call it. I'll call you that. It doesn't matter, because really what we are looking at is a family of symptoms. Do you have enough of these symptoms to rise to the point that you need a higher level of care than a quote unquote recreational user. And I try to make them, especially with what I do, is understand that if you're a pornography addict, and I struggled with this myself, if you're a pornography addict, this is not a reflection on your values. This is not a reflection on being perverted. And I almost have to, as I did, be ushered into the idea that it's an addiction. That doesn't mean you're a bad person. That doesn't mean you're a freak. Whether it's the drinking or the alcohol or the porn in my case, and just admitting to yourself that there is an issue there, no matter what you want to call it.
Yeah, it's really well put.
So here we defined addiction as a compulsive habit or action that causes harm. With alcohol, we know what the harm is, but what's wrong with pornography?
Well, it's not so much that, and we can talk about the social issues with pornography. We can talk about the ethical issues with pornography, but I don't actually make that my argument. Yeah, I could go down the trafficking roads. We could talk about how the performers are treated, but I have never found any of these social or value angles to it actually stop anybody from using. They don't care how the person on the screen was treated when they were making this kind of stuff. They don't care what happened to them. That's not going to make them stop. And that's something that I try not to have any judgment involved, because there already is so much self-judgment when it comes to something like pornography. And what I find is that I really try very hard to not talk about the content of the pornography. We can talk about the concept of pornography. We all know what we're talking about. We can talk about the concept of self-pleasure. We all know what we're talking about. We don't have to get into graphic details. And once people recognize that this thing they've been hiding forever, they can talk openly to me about it, and there's not going to be any judgment, and it's going to be looked at in a very scientific, mathematical sort of way. You have a problem. Let's be detectives and figure it out. And then let's be smart little scientists and mathematicians and figure out how to solve that problem that we've discovered. And then we will get you there. And it removes the value. It removes the taboo, which I think, unlike a lot of addictions out there that are more mainstream, that's the toughest part I face, is just somebody admitting they even look at the material.
Joshua, just to add to Tanim's point, I think the way you framed that was brilliant. But you get people out there now, because porn is widely available. People will tell themselves, okay, I watch porn and so on, but it's not harming anyone. I'm doing it myself and so on. How can we explain what are the harms that a person does to themselves by becoming engaged in that behavior regularly?
Well, one of the things that I actually tell them to try to have them understand the addiction is that addiction is addiction is addiction is addiction. If you were addicted to anything else, it would feel very much the same. You're going after the same kind of pleasure chemicals in your head. And I'll let them know that we could be sitting here talking about food. We could be sitting here talking about 20 other things. Excuse me. We could be sitting here talking about so many other things. It just happens to be pornography. And I also have to drive the point home with the pornography is that this is not a man's disease. This is not a young person's disease. This is not a poor person's disease. So many people come to me and are like, I'm not the demographic for this. And you have to explain, there is no demographic for this. This is like everything else. And really taking the shame away from the fact that they have been looking at graphic sexual imagery and trying to make them understand you were doing it because your brain was begging you to do it. You were not doing it because you're a filthy little pervert.
But are there any harms to the individual himself from this addiction?
So Tanim, sorry, go on, Joshua.
I was going to say on a, everything that goes with every other addiction for the most part is true when it comes to the brain. Obviously, there are different side effects with drugs and alcohol that won't happen with pornography. A lot more with pornography, what you see are the mental health effects really kicking in after a while. There is such a thing as, causing yourself injury, but it really is more about the isolation, the never going out and seeing everybody, it affecting relationships so deeply. I don't think, and I don't want to, say this addiction's the worst, but I don't believe that partners, meaning wives, husbands, boyfriends, girlfriends, I don't believe that there's any other addiction aside from pornography and intercourse addiction that so hurts a partner on a deep, deep, deep level as a sexual-based addiction, because they think it has to do with them. And that's also part of it, is that the addict carries around all this shame and all this fear of hiding this for years. I've talked to people who've hid their addiction from their wife or their husband for 20 years because they were afraid what's going to happen. What if my kids find out I do this? What if? So there's so much shame and so much secrecy around it that it makes people sick just hiding it from others.
Yeah, and I think it really, from my experience, Josh, it puts a strain on the relationships. I work with a few clients with porn addiction. It puts a strain on relationships. It can impact the trust of a relationship, the same as lots of addictions, with the lying, the hiding up things, suddenly finding out, like you say, Josh, after all those years, suddenly my husband has been watching porn all this time. Did they not like me? It brings up a lot of insecurities and challenges for the partner, creates a lot of strain and pressure on the relationship and on the marriage if they're married, and can have a really big impact.
Absolutely. And that's why I also became trained as a betrayal trauma coach, because as I was going through it myself, it's like, okay, this porn addiction's a big deal. I wrote my first book and I didn't get pounded with messages from addicts. I got pounded with messages from their wives and girlfriends saying, you fixed yourself. How do I fix this guy? And it's like, well, that's not. And then I started to learn about betrayal trauma. And I realized if I'm going to treat this addiction, I almost have to treat the partner as much, because they are suffering. They believe that they are the problem. And I always give the example of my own life where I became a porn addict at 12 years old. I met my wife when I was 26. She didn't find out I was a porn addict till I was 36. If I had 14 years before I met her as an addict, how could she have anything to do with it? It's not, you have to really convince the partner it has nothing to do with you on a very basic level. And that's something that I was surprised to discover in my journey of learning to be a practitioner.
Yeah.
Nasir?
I was going to say, Tanim, the reason the question that you asked in the beginning was so important is, in order to recover, you need two key things. You need to recognize that you have an addiction, but you don't have to label it. Like Joshua makes a good point. You don't have to label yourself an addict, but know that you're engaging in some sort of repetitive behavior, or that you struggle to avoid it, or you feel an urge or a compulsive desire. So you have to recognize that there's a problem. But the second thing you need to recognize is that it's harmful for you. You're not going to stop anything if you don't think it's going to cause you any harm. And Joshua and Luke made a good point that traditionally, a lot of the addictions share common things where they harm you from. On a spiritual aspect, we know that our body we are made up of our body, our mind, our heart, our soul, and our spirit. And this is talking from a faith perspective. And the addictions will affect every single element of those. The body one can be specific for alcohol, liver disease, pornography, erectile dysfunction, performance issues, ejaculation issues, and then the mind impact tends to be similar. It's associated with anxiety. Some of those are associated with more aggressive behaviors, as well as depression and this feeling of loneliness and social isolation. It affects your heart and your moral self. You feel hopeless. You feel like a failure. You feel shame. And it affects your spirit because it takes you away from your purpose. Those desires and those addictions almost take over your purpose of life. And from a faith perspective or an Islam perspective, that thing that Luke and Joshua touched on is removing the shame, because it tends to be a cultural issue. Certainly from an Asian or a Pakistani background, these kind of things shouldn't even be mentioned. They shouldn't be talked about. It's taboo, which is interesting because a lot of most Pakistanis or Asians tend to be Muslims, and really they should draw their lessons from Islam. And Islam gives you a strategy for addiction. It did it, but people don't look at it. And I'll go through it very, very briefly. I don't know, Joshua or Luke, if you're aware, but alcohol, gambling, they're prohibited in Islam. But if somebody thinks about Islam, they think, oh, okay, that's just a rule. That's how it was. There must have been a revelation that said, don't drink. And that's not the case. When the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace be upon him, first arrived, it was 2 years later when there was a verse or a revelation about alcohol and gambling. And it wasn't to say stop. It said, tell your followers that with alcohol and intoxicant, there is some benefits and there are some evil and some harms. The harms outweigh the benefits. That was the first revelation. And companions and followers at the time, that's not a prohibition. So they didn't stop. They didn't think, oh, it was mentioned that there's more harm, so maybe we should cut down. The next revelation was 2 or 3 years later. And that revelation said, refrain, to the nearest effect, refrain from being intoxicated when you pray. And in Islam, we pray 5 times a day. So again, no prohibition. But the companions and the followers at the time said, oh, okay, well, we can still drink, but before prayer time, I'll make sure I don't drink an hour before. Or after the night prayers when I'll have a drink. This is Islam giving you strategy of how to slowly reduce your habit. Because when we believe God is all and heals, then that's we're getting wisdom there from how it's a journey that takes time. And it was only a further 3 or 4 years later when the revelation was that alcohol and intoxicants are harmful for you. Refrain, shun yourself from them. So over 9 years before alcohol was stopped, and listening to Joshua telling us about how long he was addicted for, how long it took for him to recover, and Luke telling us about his journey, you get an idea. If people in our cultures or our communities understood that this isn't a taboo thing, if somebody comes to me and says, I've got an alcohol problem, I'm not going to tell them, well, that's wrong, it's prohibited, you need to stop. I'll tell them exactly what the Quran says and tell them how it's going to be a journey. I hope that kind of gives you an idea.
So basically, going cold turkey is not the solution.
It's dangerous for you in terms of alcohol. People, if somebody comes to me who's Luke will know this best, and obviously Joshua as well because he's struggled in the past. Somebody comes to me as a doctor and says, "That's it. I want to give up drinking. I want to stop right now." I will tell them, "No, do not go home and stop. Reduce and put them on a detox strategy." That's how key and it's important is for people to know that it is a journey.
So this is a nice segue into the next phase of the conversation, which is, okay, if someone does have an addiction, then what is the path to become free from that addiction? And Dr. Nasir, you're saying the sort of the Islamic blueprint is to reduce over time and not go cold turkey. Is there anything else that is part of this blueprint before we move on to, other possible strategies or methodologies?
There's a few key aspects when it comes to addiction that I help people recover, and the first thing is they need to be able to. It's not a process. You want to look at the person as a whole. What led to this? What behavior? You need a conversation. Everyone's story is individual, and their issue is individualized. They're all going to have different challenges. But I mentioned recognizing that there's an addiction, recognizing that there's harm, and recognizing that one of the key aspects is removing shame and hopelessness. I want to stop, and then when I go home, I'll do it again. Oh, that's it. I failed. There's no point carrying on. Letting people know that it's going to be a slow journey, and so the journey to recovery from addiction is the same journey to addiction. It's got to be repetitive resistance of that behavior over time. It's just got to be building that new habit of stopping, as well as recognizing your triggers and adjusting your environment where you can. So trigger recognition is key. Community support is key. Repetitive resistance behavior, some sort of target development or setting yourself goals, even if you were to slip up and so on, is fine. But once you start setting them, it gets you into a mindset of recognizing them, and also is seeking help from a higher power. And in our case, God, looking for support and looking for help ultimately gives people motivation. But it'd be really nice to hear from Josh and Luke about what they did and how they found it, and be learning for me, because again, I've got to say, listening to people with the experience is so much more beneficial.
And also people that are working day in and day out with others going through that process. So love to hear from you, Luke. How does one break free from an addiction?
Yeah, so I think one thing I want to add, Doctor, as well, is like a caveat that, yes, I think it's extremely important for people to have a medical detox when they're at a dependent level of drinking. Like I said, if they're drinking a litre of bottle of vodka a day, or if they're having withdrawal symptoms, it's really important to have a detox in hospital, rehab, to see a trained professional and to not just stop drinking, because it can be dangerous and they can have, obviously, withdrawal symptoms and seizures, etc. But I will add the caveat that a lot of the clients I come across aren't at that level yet. They may be drinking, They may be binge drinking, they may be drinking even a little bit each day, or just at the weekend, or a few times a week, boil of wine a night, 3 days a week or something. And in those cases, it can be safe to completely just stop drinking. And it's okay just to stop drinking, basically, and to maybe cut down a bit, but just to stop. That's okay. And some ways to stop is firstly being aware and mindful of the cycle of addiction, right? Being aware of your triggers, cravings, and justifications. What's triggering you? What are the craving thoughts going through your mind? How are you justifying that behavior? And really kind of mapping that out and writing it down. And as you start to become aware of your triggers and start to write them down and map them out, you can then learn to stop acting on them, because with addiction, we're feeling some kind of emotion or feeling. And as a result of that, we don't want to feel it. So we then numb it out with a drink or drug or porn or whatever it may be. So it's really important to learn to sit with those emotions and process them and develop healthy coping mechanisms. Now, for me, one of those healthy coping mechanisms that really worked, or the training ground to develop them, was through addiction therapy. By having addiction therapy and going back to my therapist every single week, week after week, I was able to talk through all my emotions and past and all of that kind of stuff, and learn how to manage my emotions and sit with them and deal with the triggers. And at the beginning, some of the triggers were just a Friday night, or going to see a friend, or socializing. And as time went on, the triggers got bigger. Maybe it was a breakup with my ex, or it was doing a degree, or something bigger that would come at me that I'd have to deal with in my recovery and not slip, and learn to sit with those emotions and process them. And the tools I sort of integrated into my life to process those emotions are things like meditation, journaling, and working and doing exercise, and all of that kind of stuff is really important to learn healthy ways to not change the way you feel and numb your emotions with a drink or drug, but learn to soothe your emotions and nurture yourself. And I think that's really important.
Fantastic.
I mean,
I would also just to back into what Luke said about cold turkey. I myself went the cold turkey route, and I decided to do that because, number one, I was a functional alcoholic who, while I did do a short detox, it was not very dramatic. I knew that if I was going to quit both of my addictions at the same time, which I did, I was going to have to go cold turkey on either of them. Because if I tapped into that dopamine, or if I was in that intoxicated state, I was going to rationalize and justify using the other thing, because that was my pattern for years. So I had to quit both at the same time. And it's possible. As far as in what I do, I urge people to create a urge journal or a trigger journal very early on, where I tell them, the next 2 weeks, all I want you to do, whether you use or not, every time you get that strong urge, every time you get that strong trigger, I want you to write down the time. I want you to write down where you are, and I want you to write down what has happened in the last 15 minutes. And even if you don't use, it's important to recognize the triggers. And after doing this for a few days, what you're going to recognize is that there are patterns, and there may be patterns that you've never figured out, or there may be excuses there in your patterns. Like, I can't go to sleep at night unless I look at pornography and pleasure myself to it. Well, in the history of mankind, nobody has ever stayed up for the rest of time because they didn't look at pornography. So what we have to do is look at the urges and triggers, understand that there are fallacies to the thinking of needing to use them. And then when you are in a regular state, when you are in a sober state, to understand the urges will come back. So while we're sitting here in a sober state right now, let's prepare. Let's prepare for what you're going to do when the next urge hits. When the next urge hits, what are you going to do if you are outside by yourself? What are you going to do if you're inside by yourself? What if you're around a group of people? What do you need to do in various situations to be able to curb the behavior or curb the urge or trigger to hopefully not use by replacing the behavior? And once you start repeating that, once you bring the overall level of the addictive behavior down, then you can start digging into the trauma, digging into the backstory and the origin story of what happened. Because to me, that's really where the magic is at. It's not just about stopping a behavior. Just stopping a behavior is fasting. You have to be able to go deeper than the fast and understand, why are you fasting from this thing in the first place?
The root cause.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say as well, that's one reason I don't think rehab is the be all and end all. One thing you said, Josh, really stuck out to me is that sense of integrating the change, learning what triggers are happening in your life. And when you go to rehab, you're in the rehab bubble for 14, 28 days. But when you get out, all of those triggers you left behind are still there. Right? And I think it's about learning to deal with those triggers and the emotions those triggers bring up in your daily life. That's why I love what you said, Josh, when it's like writing down all your triggers, where it happened, what's going on in your life, where were you triggered to go and do that unhealthy behavior. Let's work on overcoming those, because that's about what's happening in your life. It's integrating that change. And if you can do that, and you can change your reaction to those triggers and lessen the triggers and sort of work on the trauma and all that kind of stuff, but like you said, Josh, in the short term, lessen the triggers and learn to overcome them with healthy cope mechanisms, in my opinion, your recovery will last a lot longer, because you're learning how to cope in normal everyday life, which I think is really important for long-term sobriety and recovery.
And I'll quickly say that I had 2 trips to rehab. First for my alcohol, which was 10 weeks, and then for the pornography, which was 7 weeks. And what I really learned is it's very easy to heal around a bunch of people who also have the same affliction and want to heal and are lifting you up. And yes, rehab becomes a bubble. It's a wonderfully safe bubble.
Yeah.
But when I came home, it was like, okay, I'm better. but everybody else is the same person. Everybody else is treating me like the old version of myself. And that's why I like helping people who have to integrate this into their everyday life, because that's real life. Real life is not being in a nice little, hospital up on a hill in some beautiful place where you are made healthy meals every day and you are led through exercises and yoga. At least that's not my regular life. So I had to come home and reintegrate to real life. And I think if you can just learn how to change your real life along the way, much like Luke said, you're probably going to have better results.
I want to pose a different kind of question now, which is around the role of trauma and the link with addiction. So in your experience working with lots of people who are afflicted by some kind of addiction, what role and how often was trauma or some kind of trauma, the trigger for this behavior or part of the story?
100%.
Oh, okay. So I'm going to go back to your story. What trauma caused a 12-year-old you to start that?
There was sexual abuse at the hands of a babysitter when I was young that I was not really able to process. And then on top of that, there was a fair amount of mental abuse at the hands of my grandmother, who essentially thought I was a liar for everything. And she was my, number 2, number 3 caregiver. Mm-hmm. So what happened there is that I questioned everything about myself, because when she's telling me that I'm lying, well, I don't think I'm lying, but am I lying? She's the grown up. And that was a real tough thing for years and years. And it wasn't until I got into recovery that I even recognized that as trauma. And not knowing if you have trauma is different than not having trauma. A lot of the time, the body takes care of us. And a lot of time, those horrific things, those traumatic things get sent to the back so you can function every day. And it's bringing those things to the surface and recognizing you did not have the problem-solving skills to deal with these. Yeah. That's why you entered into addiction, because it was a quick fix. And you quickly learned that quick fix could apply to just about anything. It didn't have to be traumatic. Pornography makes a bad day okay, but it also makes an okay day pretty good. So why don't we do this every day, regardless of trauma or problems? And that's what, the way that we have to look at this is that there was some beginning event, whether you remember it or not. There was some kind of atmosphere, some kind of culture that was driving you towards this. And that has to sometimes be uncovered before it can be addressed.
Well, so your answer is it's 100% link. There's a 100% link between trauma and addiction.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Dr. Nasir, what would you say?
Something that we find in pornography use, for example, is there's a higher association with childhood abuse, and it can be a vicious repeating cycle. And we find that with alcohol as well, there seems to be a lot of trauma. Remember, these addictions are things that bring people pleasure. They make you feel happy in the moment, and sometimes people search for it because they're not happy in the moment. So there's definitely that link. There's definitely that need to recognize it. But in this day and age, Tanim, you don't necessarily need to have a trauma now to become addicted. We live in a hugely pressurized world right now. Everyone feels low. Everyone feels increased pressure. Social media's impact on children and their ability to live up to a certain standard. Pressures, demands at work, toxic conversations and on toxic news stories. People are struggling, and like Joshua said, a quick fix is what people want, and that's what leads them down this route. So that association is definitely there. But there's a lot of people now who just their daily, their normal working day is almost like a traumatic experience for them. Coronavirus was a big learning lesson. During the COVID period and during lockdown in the UK, use of child pornography images went up not 10%, not 100%. It went up 3,000%. And this led to people being alone and by themselves. And like I said, nobody wakes up one day probably wanting to look at those kind of images. It tends to happen from a repetitive behavior with the developing tolerance to certain things, and something else is developing as a result. So I wanted to ask Luke and Joshua and yourself, Tanim, the impact of loneliness, being alone. Because for me, that seems to be a major trigger that we've recognized, being alone. So there's a usual triggers. You've got your friends that like a drink, or you've got a pub culture or so on. But being isolated and being alone seems to be a very powerful trigger, and people seem to struggle with how to adjust or manage that.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that loneliness is definitely a trigger. And I feel like it's a double-edged sword or a cycle, because as we go through the addictive behavior and it gets worse and worse and worse, and perhaps we start to lie and we start to kind of hide our behavior because of the shame and guilt, we start to push people away, whether that's in a faith context of God or your religion or your higher power. You're definitely pushing them away. Your partner, you're definitely pushing away the connection to yourself. And as you start to push those things away because of the guilt and shame, that leads to more isolation and loneliness. And that loneliness and isolation becomes a trigger to use more. And then you push more away because you're getting deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole. So I definitely agree that loneliness is a big trigger, for sure, 100%.
Yeah, absolutely. I make this kind of flippant remark when I do presentations like this, where I talk about when I went to alcohol rehab, alcohol recovery, I had people slap me on the back and shake my hand and say, "You're going to battle that demon. Congratulations." And then when I say I'm going to pornography rehab, they don't want to shake my hand. They want to go find the hand sanitizer. And that's one of the big problems with the pornography, is that they don't want to have anybody know that they do this, even in the greatest of times. So when you come up to a time like the pandemic, my third book was called Porn in the Pandemic, and I looked at the how online porn changed. Online porn grew in the first 3 months of the pandemic, what probably would have taken 5 years in regular time. Why was that? Because nobody could go anywhere. Everybody was stuck at home. You couldn't go on dates. You couldn't go see people. People have natural sexual urges. So people who weren't addicts suddenly found themselves in front of the computer, in front of their phone, and they were isolated, and they fell into this rabbit hole that they otherwise might not have. And because there is so much taboo, because there is so much shame around naked human bodies and sexuality, that the isolation is the cornerstone issue of what I do. Most of the time, whether somebody's been an addict for 4 years or 40 years, I'm quite often the first person they've ever talked to about this. I see people talk to me, they show up looking like a deer in headlights, just scared to death that they're going to have to say the word masturbation out loud. And I consider it a successful first session if by the end of it, they're more relaxed and sitting back and able to open up about it, because we didn't help their addiction very much at all that first session. But if they can feel like they're not alone anymore, they're not isolated anymore, that's a huge step forward, that other people in the world have experienced this.
Tanim, just I mean, it was really interesting to hear exactly what Luke and Joshua have said about loneliness and isolation, and just from the Islamic perspective, And certainly my supervisor and guide in self-development and so on talks about. It's interesting because Luke used that word double-edged sword, and what we would say is that's exactly what being alone is. You can either use one end of the sword to cut your ties with God, the divine, and our spiritual being, and fall into the hands of behaviors that are going to be harmful, or you can use it to cut yourself away from the devil and your demons. So loneliness can it's a big trigger for many of these things, but you can turn loneliness into your salvation and your way of recovering. And I remember Luke touched on earlier about meditation and so on, and that's what seems to be missing because people feel down, depressed. Humans are made to enjoy company. We enjoy being in the presence. And when you're alone and you're by yourself, you look for an out. And that's where having a drink or doing a drug or watching porn or something gives you a temporary fix. They feel like they're making themselves feel better, but it's the completely wrong food or fuel for the spirit. And what we try to promote is people understand that they're not alone, and to use that time to develop that connection with God, our creator. And that's a simple thing that can be done. And it's developing. That's where we feel people are probably missing things. It's because they lost that connection and they feel isolated. When if you start developing that connection with God, and just we're talking about the King of all kings, the creator, the best and the most grand of qualities, and you just spend time thinking about them being with you right now, it helps remove that feeling of loneliness. Thinking of them as somebody that's there to save you, to help you, to heal you. Don't get rid of it. Get rid of those shameful, connotations where I'm doing wrong or I'm sinning. You're now alone. It's just you and your Lord, and speak to them, asking them for help, because they are the ones that can give you the biggest lift, if you like. And how you are alone is important because it can give you a glimpse, we say, into how you will be when you die. We all want to be, righteous or pious or good people when it comes to our death, and we can get to heaven, if you like. But how you are in public doesn't determine that, because everyone puts a face on in public. Everyone knows how to behave. When you're alone, that's a real mirror into your who you are as a person and what you are. And people, you'll almost certainly, the state you are when you are alone is going to be the state at your time of death. So we encourage people to turn being alone into a spiritual, meditative, healing process, instead of them thinking, look, I'm down, I'm by myself, and I'm depressed, and flooding their mind with all the worries that they have and look for a quick fix. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I was just going to say, I can agree. I think, solitude isn't loneliness, right? You can be in your own solitude, and that can be amazing in recovery, to have time to meditate or pray or be by yourself and journal, reflect on yourself and be with you, and to feel your emotions and process them and be okay with just being yourself and be okay with not being okay sometimes. And that solitude is a really important, powerful thing to be able to sit with self.
100%.
I have an interesting question. Well, it's interesting to me, knowing what you know in terms of the harms of I'm going to ask Joshua first. Knowing the harms of pornography, would the world be a better place if pornography didn't exist?
I think that's like a chicken and egg question. Pornography is always going to exist. And I look at this two different ways. From just a human point of view, it is completely natural for people, especially around the age of puberty, to be curious about sexuality. Sexuality is not a bad thing. Sexuality is a wonderful thing. Unhealthy sexuality is not a good thing. So we have to understand that you are not sick just because you're interested or curious about depictions of sexuality. That is not what makes you necessarily ill. So it's going to happen anyway. People are just hardwired to be. This is how we make other people, is through sexuality. It's a good thing. but also looking at the very practical side of things, I bring up the fact that here in America, 100 years ago, we tried to outlaw drinking. And it was a horrible, horrible experiment that failed greatly and created so many more problems that they had to stop all the bad side effects, they had to make alcohol legal again. And this was before we had international telecommunications. This was before we had the kind of technology that we have today, the kind of transportation systems we have today. So when people ask me the question, shouldn't we just ban pornography? It's that can't happen. It's not going to happen. So let's not bang our head against the wall. The way that you fix problems is not by putting your head in the sand and pretending they're not there. The way you fix problems is through education.
So would you let your children engage with pornography?
I would not encourage them to use pornography. I would explain, and I have explained, the dangers of pornography, but I think it is silly to believe that they have never looked at pornography. Much like, the fact that my daughter is now in her mid-20s and has a live-in boyfriend. I would love to pretend that she is still the virgin she was at 13 years old. But I know otherwise. We have to accept a level of sexuality and healthy sexuality out there. And also to understand that the pornography, when it comes to addiction, it's not really, especially after the beginning, it's not about what the naked people are doing to each other. It's about the fact that the only way I know to get this relief is by looking at this stuff. That's where I say addiction is addiction is addiction. It could just as easily be casinos and gambling. It can just as easily be alcohol. You found a thing that helped you. And most of the time I was an addict, I couldn't tell you what I looked at as my final piece of pornography because it didn't matter. I just needed to get to the finish line. It was just a tool by which I served the demons in my head that needed those chemicals. It really wasn't about the sexy ladies. It really wasn't about the activity that was going on. It was about the relief it gave me in my head.
It's Luke had to leave at 8 o'clock, so he did give his regards before leaving. I would like to give the opportunity now to those who have tuned in to pose some questions to Joshua and Dr. Nasir. We already have some questions here, and before I do that,
whilst you're I was just going to say, whilst you're loading up the question, just to add to Joshua gave, it's I mean, this is a faith edge podcast. There's the Islamic premise to how we want to help heal people. But the question you asked, Joshua, and the way you answered it was so brilliant. In fact, would the world be better off without pornography? And part of what we do in Wise Life Academy and trying to help people battle or navigate the stresses in life is make them understand the purpose of this world, dunya, this world, and the reason we're created. And I mean, I'd encourage people to look at the Wise Life website and so on to help them in their own personal journeys. But we're not here. We've been created. We are heavenly beings. We are from heaven. God has created us, and we've all got our own place in heaven. For us to just earn that and taste that, we've been sent here to purify our character and develop human and good quality traits, forgiving, loving, caring. And you can't develop any of those characteristics. You cannot develop that personality unless you have challenges. You can't tell me to be generous, or I cannot learn to be generous if I'm not surrounded by poverty. I cannot learn to be patient if I'm not surrounded by anger, obstruction, and I cannot learn to be have a character that resists and rejects harmful or bad things if you didn't have addictions that give you that temptation. So having a world without pornography or alcohol, I said, would be pointless because it defeats the object of why we're here. We've got to show that strength of resisting, and if we fall into it, getting ourselves out.
No, that's wonderful, and very much in line. And that's what's incredible is, like, the clinical sort of the clinicians, the practitioners, and the faith element. It's all in agreement that this is how things work, and this is the way to sort things. And in sort of the Muslim community, there's added shame because it's a sin, and yet we know statistically that these kind of addictions, maybe not alcohol but pornography for sure, are rife. And part of it is the access, like you can see more in 10 minutes now than you could have seen in a lifetime 200 years ago or 300 years ago or even 80 years ago. You can see more in 10 minutes on this device than someone would have seen in an entire lifetime. So it's become a very pressing matter. And I'm really pleased to be able to learn from the two of you who are on the grassroots at the forefront of helping people out of this. So before we go to questions, I would like to ask each of you in one or two sentences, what is your message to someone who is struggling with an addiction? So I'll start with Joshua.
You are the stories that you tell yourself, and those stories as an addict are probably incorrect. When I had to face the fact that I was going to have to drop alcohol and I was going to have to drop pornography, a fear came across. So how do I deal with life? How do I deal with life if the two things that I could count on for the last 20 plus years go away? My life is going to be horrible after this point. And now that I've lived 11 years without these things, my life is better than it ever has been. I am healthier at 48 years old. I look younger at 48 years old than I did at 28 years old. I'm happier. I'm healthier socially, spiritually, mentally, physically. The other side of addiction is such a wonderful place, but because, and someone like myself who was two addictions over 2 decades, you get so grounded, and this is the way it is, this is the way life is, you never think to yourself, there is freedom out there, there is another way out there, and oh my gosh, it might even be better. And that's what I keep trying to tell people who are very new into addiction. No matter what it's from. If you see this through, I promise you, I guarantee you, it's going to be better on the other side.
Amazing. Thank you for that. Dr. Nasir?
I don't think I can top that, really. If I had a sentence, it would be see if you can attend the workshop that we're running on the 25th of January.
Oh,
nice plug.
Nice plug.
But just Tanim, on the Islamic aspect, I would say, get rid of any shame. Get rid of any hopelessness. This is not something that you are suffering or dealing with by yourself. It is a prevalent problem across the world. And I want people just to remember that we have a God that doesn't care about results. He cares about effort. If I went to do an exam and I revised my hardest and tried my best and I didn't get the results, this world will say I failed and I'm out. Our God rewards us just by putting effort in. So if you're struggling with an addiction and if you're finding it hard and you keep tripping up, but the fact that you're trying, keep trying, because if you were to pass or leave this life having still been a porn addict or still been an alcoholic addict, but you were trying to get better, you'll be rewarded. Okay.
That's incredibly encouraging, and I guess combats that feeling of helplessness, which is very dangerous. Dangerous. That's wonderful. I would now like to open up to everyone joining us online on all the different platforms. Feel free to, I can see all of your comments, so feel free to put your questions forward. I have a really interesting question here from Imran on YouTube. Is lifelong sobriety really possible? What success stories have you seen, and what does it take?
We've got a success story. Sorry, Joshua.
Well, it's and you know what? It's a matter of framing success. I do not have to use pornography anymore to deal with life's problems or to just cope with life. I have worked on developing coping skills. I've worked on anxiety management skills, stress management skills. But it's important to recognize that this is not a catch-all. It's like somebody who takes medication for depression. You're still going to get sad. You're still going to have bad days. You're still a human. This is not a magical process by which you are going to be perfect. You are working on one aspect of your life. I tell people, if you like chocolate ice cream as an addict, you're going to like chocolate ice cream in recovery. If you like comedy movies as an addict, you're probably going to like comedy movies as recovery. But that is also true of who you are personally. And there are other things you likely need to work on yourself. And the only way you're going to improve as a person is to first get that monkey of the addiction off your back.
Love it. And Dr. Nasir, do you believe in, is it possible for somebody to be healthy from all aspects and never have any addictions? And have you met anyone like that?
Sorry, Tanim, I'm still thinking about chocolate ice cream. No, we do. We have lifestyle. So because I work at a transplant unit, so the number one cause of liver disease in this country or in the Western world is alcohol, although starting to be overtaken by fatty liver disease now. And many stories, because one of the criteria to qualify for liver transplantation in this country is showing that you've abstained from alcohol and gone through a counselling program. So we've done that in cases. There is success story. I think one of the best things you've done here, Tanim, is to invite not only two people who have gone through addiction, but have come out the other side and are helping others, because that's something that people want to do. Once you've recovered from something, there's a beauty in this world and the way God's created us, is people then want to share goodness. So it's definitely possible. And but at the beginning, it can feel like a mountain, which is at the start. I just say, look, you've just got to put some effort in and try to get rid of any feelings of hopelessness. Slipping up, tripping back into it is not a failure. In fact, recognizing when you trip up and trying again is an important step to the recovery.
Fantastic. I've just pulled up a bit of information about the workshop that you mentioned, Dr. Nasir. And we have a question here on YouTube. How do I encourage family members who are addicted, who refuse help, who say they will do it on their own, but fail to change or stop every time, and the addiction has actually broken family trust? How do you help someone in this situation?
Myself, I think that one of the most important parts of this is to understand that intentions are great, but you are not the addict yourself. No matter what you do, no matter what you hope for, no matter what boundaries are put in place, no matter what punishments are put in place, you cannot force somebody to recover if they do not want to go through that journey. And what I always urge, especially when I'm dealing with my betrayal trauma clients, is number one, even if you are completely disgusted by their behavior, do not judge them, because, or to do not judge them to their face. They need a safe place. They need a place that they can talk. They need a place that they can start. And usually in a nurturing environment, that is your family. That is your partner. And so you almost have to try to treat this with more compassion and love. And I am here for you. And let people like me do the really hard work, and just support and love and don't judge and create a safe place and let them know how much you care about them and how much they can do this. And I think that those are the best conditions for which somebody can take those steps into getting professional help.
I've got to ask. I won't ask you online, Joshua, because it's a personal question. But I wonder if you are a man of faith, because the answers you're giving and the examples you're drawing on are prophetic examples, and exactly the way I would have answered that question. I would say to the person that's asked the question is, you can't force anyone to do anything. And people, you're not responsible either. So sometimes you do feel guilty, but people are adults. They have their own free will and they will make their decisions. The best thing you can do is be a supportive, positive character in their life. If you go in there with any judgment, even though it will be with the best intentions, but if you go in there with any judgments or any negativity or any, like maybe looking in disgust or so on, that will turn people away and it can make the situation worse. Because in a family situation, that's one of the places people try to find comfort or solitude or support. And if that becomes difficult for them, that just drives them further away. And things might get worse for them. Their gambling addiction might have ruined their financial situation and so on. And they will just hide and keep things away from you. So showing a supportive, positive characteristics and just making things easy. And then slowly, once they find that you're just a loving, non-judgmental, caring person that only thinks about their best interests but isn't here to judge them, then you can slowly invite them to a podcast like this, or a workshop, or a gathering of some friends, or introduce them to somebody else that might have gone through addiction. And that's the best way to do it. But you can't fix anyone by just telling them you need to stop, it's wrong, get better. But that positive character, which is exactly what Joshua was just talking about, showing them love, showing them compassion, and letting them see, do you know what, I want to become an example of the Prophet ﷺ yourself, because people were drawn to them, so others will be drawn to you.
And it's so funny and terrifying that the standard reaction to trying to help someone is to basically force them, shame them. It's literally, this is our standard procedure in most cases, which again, it's never going to work. And we need to come closer to a non-judgmental, caring, loving, accepting, empathetic way and approach. And yeah, so I've got one more question. What about acceptable or harmless addictions like phones, video games? I'm thinking Netflix. Are these also dangerous addictions? Is this also something we should take? Should we go and attend a workshop if we feel like we may have a phone addiction or a social media addiction? Do you see these as lesser evils or negligible?
Well, there are studies out there that actually measure dopamine and how, I don't like to compare one addiction to another, but there are some that release more dopamine than others. But no, there is no good addiction. By definition, addiction isn't a good thing. Habits can be good things, but addiction is not a good thing. And you talk about video games, you talk about your phone. What I look at as the litmus test is, how is this affecting your life? How is this bringing you down? One of the sort of experiments that I explain to the partners of porn addicts who don't understand addiction, don't understand that magnetic pull. I tell them, when you wake up tomorrow morning, take out your phone, turn up the volume on everything, every ding, every buzz, everything that can happen to your phone. Turn that all the way up, and then take a note card and tape it to the front of your phone, and then put your phone next to you. There's going to be a buzz or a ding or something within a few minutes, and you're going to want to look at it, but you can't. And then within a few more minutes, there's going to be another ding, another buzz. And even though you know it's probably just someone liking an Instagram photo, it's probably something that's completely innocuous, most people don't last an hour. Most people don't last 5 or 6 dings or beeps on their phone, because we use our phones as these little dopamine machines. Are you getting as much dopamine as with one of the traditional addictions? No, you're not. But you see people in restaurants using their phone. You see people in church using their phone. You see people driving in traffic using their phone. These are bad decisions. So obviously there's something somewhat broken happening there. Yeah, I think that some people can have a phone habit, and there are people who can have a phone addiction. Absolutely.
I think it's a good question, Tanim, that this your audience members asked, because people will likely refrain from seeking help because they will probably think it's a lesser or a harmless addiction and so on. People know what's bad and what's good out there, what are bad habits and what are good habits. So they don't need a scientific lecture regarding any of it. But everything Joshua's just told you about smartphone use, I mean, we live in an age where social media is rampant, and it leads to cyberbullying. It leads to kids feeling suicidal. There's associations with reduced academic achievement. It's associated with sleep problems, depression, loneliness. All of these are the same kind of similar themes you get across all addictions that are associated with smartphone use. Overeating, if you have to go somewhere for pleasure, to just when you feel down and you go to a chocolate bar and so on, is going to result in the same thing. So I wouldn't call them harmless, but they might be harder for people just to recognize that they've got this compulsive habitual behavior, and the body likes balance, everything in balance. So recognizing something that you're doing too often and too much is again something we would use or implement the same strategies to help you get out of.
Amazing. We have a few comments appreciating the discussion and how important this discussion is, and how interesting it has been and how informative it has been. I thank all of you for taking time out to share your perspective, your experience, your knowledge, and your gems with us. And I hope that my audience has thoroughly benefited. I know I've benefited a lot. Fun fact, I've just started trauma coaching myself, working one-to-one with a trauma coach. I didn't know I had trauma. And as someone who values personal development and continuous growth, I had my first session yesterday, and wow, what an eye opener it was. So
you definitely mean you're not completely healed yet?
Not in one session. We've got 6 months ahead of us, but it's like, yeah, it was incredibly eye-opening how much we may be carrying. You mentioned earlier that the body remembers the trauma, and it pushes it at the back. Sometimes it's stored in the body and we don't even realize. And the first thing she said that hit me was that trauma is like poison in the body, and it happens when your nervous system doesn't know how to process something, and then it becomes that there's an unhealthy outcome from there. So without going into too much detail, I just encourage everybody watching this to consider looking a little bit deeper, do a bit more work, and really put in the effort to make your life better by uncovering the layers and really shining the light on things that maybe need a bit of work, and having that courage to face some difficult truths, and it can only be good for you. like Joshua said, that overcoming those addictions has only made his life better in 100 different ways. So we wish that for everybody. Once again, I thank you both, and I hope to continue this conversation at some point, because I'm sure there's a lot more that we can speak about. And I wish you both a wonderful evening. I think it's actually afternoon for for Joshua on the West Coast. You're on the West Coast, right?
No, I'm
Sorry,
on the East
yeah,
Coast. I'm on the
sorry,
East Coast, but I'm still living in the past.
All right. Yes, you're in the plan for sure.
Yeah.
Probably like 5 hours behind us.
Yep.
So we're getting ready for dinner now. So thank you, a massive heartfelt thank you. And so one final question that's come up as a follow-up: are there any resources available? I would encourage Iman on YouTube to have a look at Wise Life Academy. And also, Joshua, how can people get in touch with you and look into more of what you have to offer?
Yeah, just hit my website for all of my socials, all of my books, everything like that. And my website is thatcorncoach.com. It's not porn, because we can't say porn on social media. And it turns out nobody wants to type the word porn into their computer.
Yeah.
So it has become thatcorncoach.com.
Awesome. Thank you
Fantastic.
both, and have a lovely rest of your week. God bless, and until the next time, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Take